Bonjour everybody, or I guess I say bon matin. Je suis Pamela Isfeld, la présidente de la PAS, et je vous souhaite la bienvenue. We're here at our second annual TRADECRAFT week to talk about the Your Foreign Service Friend pilot mentorship program for Indigenous students. And I am with William Dunlop, who is an Indigenous and member of PAFSO's executive committee, who has volunteered to take this on. And I'm going to turn over the virtual mic to him to introduce himself and tell you about all the excellent experience that he has and what we are looking to achieve with this PAFSO initiative. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and we acknowledge them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of these lands. So, William, over to you.
Thank you, Pam. So yes, I'm here today to talk about Your Foreign Service Friend, which is a foreign service mentorship initiative for Indigenous students. Next slide, please. So let me introduce myself. My name is William Dunlop. I'm an immigration foreign service officer. I've been with IRCC for about 10 years now. I'm an Indigenous foreign service officer, and I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So I've been overseas since 2012, and I joined PAFSO XCOM last year, mostly serving on the professional development and the collective bargaining committees. Prior to joining IRCC, I worked in staffing at Correctional Service of Canada, and I've recently become interested in reconciliation for a number of reasons. I guess the most important one is that in the time that I left Canada back in 2012 and the time that I returned in 2021, I saw a bit of a difference, quite a bit of a difference in the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and this was very interesting to me. So what I want to talk to you today about is a mentorship program. This program is going to have a number of benefits, and I'm going to tell you all about the initiative in detail. So hold on to your hats. I'm also going to explain how you can contribute to the initiative as a member of a working group, as a volunteer, someone to bounce ideas off of, as a mentor for Indigenous students. And I want to hopefully entice you to participate in this initiative in some form. I'm going to describe the work that's been done on this so far, and I'm going to provide the next steps. And I'm going to provide you with a timeline on how we're going to proceed and how we plan to ensure the long-term success of this initiative. So next slide, please. So the basic idea is that many current foreign service officers have learned about their FS careers through connections and mentors already in the foreign service. But we suspect that many Indigenous students who could be interested in foreign service careers may not have had the opportunity to learn about such careers. And those who are interested in foreign service careers may benefit from having a mentor to help them along the path to this career. So just to tell you a little bit about what it's intended to do, the benefits of it are to facilitate professional development of foreign service officers in mentorship, providing an opportunity to volunteer, and to learn a bit more about Indigenous history, develop some intercultural competency with respect to Indigenous peoples as well. In terms of how it benefits PAFSO, well, I mean, like other organizations in Canada, PAFSO would benefit from contributing to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It also increases, from the point of view of the participants or the mentees to the program, it increases knowledge of foreign service careers, provides mentors for those interested in FS careers, and we think that both of those aspects will lead to greater representation of Indigenous people in the foreign service. And there's an impact of not doing this. So right now, there's limited representation of Indigenous people in the Foreign Service, and that will likely continue unless action is taken. And this would be a lost opportunity to have an impact on reconciliation in Canada. But ultimately, the objective of this is to increase student interest in and applications for and appointments to the Foreign Service in all career tracks of the Foreign Service: migration, trade, political, international development, and consular management. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering how this initiative relates to reconciliation. Well, recent events have led to increased focus on diversity and inclusion, not only in the public service, but throughout Canada. The clerk of the Privy Council's call to action on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion in the federal public service, and departmental responses to that call to action suggest that efforts are being made to increase equity and inclusion in staffing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report has provided a roadmap towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And the TRC also defined reconciliation as being about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in its calls to action, the TRC suggested 94 ways that Canadian institutions and people can make progress towards achieving that reconciliation. So among those 94 calls to action, there are several that seek the elimination of employment gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And there are numerous calls that speak to providing education on the history of Indigenous peoples. And I think that this initiative will include elements of both of those calls. So next slide, please. Right. So many recognize the importance of a diverse foreign service that is representative of the population of Canada. And the number of Indigenous persons in Canada's foreign service, although we can't be sure because of a lack of data, we feel that it appears to remain low, despite the efforts of departments to increase representation of Indigenous people. Now, PAFSO members can contribute to reconciliation by increasing our understanding of Indigenous peoples and by working toward the elimination of gaps in Indigenous persons that have foreign service careers. The Foreign Service would benefit from initiatives to expose and attract talented Indigenous persons to the career streams, which could lead to interest in and appointments to foreign service careers for Indigenous peoples. Although only the employer can make appointments to the Foreign Service, we believe that PAFSO members can still make indirect contributions toward reducing gaps in Indigenous employment through initiatives such as the one we're proposing today. PAFSO can complement departmental affairs to attract and retain Indigenous Foreign Service officers by implementing its own initiative. As Indigenous Canadians may face systemic barriers to a career in the Foreign Service, PAFSO hopes to increase Indigenous students' interest in Foreign Service careers, raising their awareness, and creating a mentorship initiative with the working title Foreign Service, Your Foreign Service Friend. And these initiatives are in line with PAFSO's professional development and diversity objectives, and will be an important step to increasing awareness, exposure, and interest in FS careers for Indigenous students. And if these initiatives are done right, we expect it will ultimately contribute to increased appointments of Indigenous applicants to the Foreign Service. So next slide, please. Now, to ensure the long-term success of this initiative, it must be run in line with specific principles and values, in my opinion. The first one is respect. So one of the core values of reconciliation and renewed relationships with Indigenous people is treating Indigenous people with respect. This means being open to different viewpoints without preconceived judgment. The next one is diversity. So I hope to, we should understand that there is no one type of Indigenous person. There is extreme in diversity, historically hundreds of nations with different cultures and languages. Next, what we want to do with this is make sure that we're engaging with Indigenous partners. So we want to adopt a nothing about us without us approach. We're going to engage with Indigenous groups to ensure that Indigenous viewpoints are considered and respected in what we are doing before we essentially break dirt on the initiative. Also, we want to play the long game. Take a methodical approach, not too fast and not too slow, to ensure long-term success. Not everything may work right away, but we'll not stop in the short run and say, oh, well, you know, this didn't work if we didn't see results immediately. And we're going to measure success, and we're going to understand why we've had setbacks, and we're going to adjust as we go along. So for this, the last principle is that all contributions are welcome. The more people involved, the better for continuity for this initiative. Next slide, please. So just to further expand on what we're doing here and what we're not doing. So what part of this initiative is to have those internal consultations and outreach to Indigenous organizations that I mentioned before. We'll have to engage with other stakeholders, including within federal government departments, with university organizations, with the Indigenous organizations within those institutions. Part of it will be having a method to attract students to what we're doing. So that will include the development of materials to introduce foreign service careers targeted to Indigenous university students. And we're going to have to execute activities related to those materials, such as webinars, panels, and this sort of thing. And finally, and most importantly, it's the development and execution of the mentorship program for Indigenous students interested in careers in the Foreign Service. But what we're not going to be able to do, of course, is to promise the employment opportunities within the Foreign Service to any participants, because this is the purview of the departments themselves. Next slide, please. So in order to get from where we are now to being able to roll out this this initiative, we're going to need a number of deliverables. And the first one is, I'm hoping, is to develop a working group. And this working group will be made up of PAFSO members and members of XCOM who are interested. We're hoping that it will include Indigenous Foreign Service officers as much as possible. The objective of this group is to complete the remaining deliverables that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So we're going to need a way to recruit participants for this initiative, and that will include through word of mouth, Foreign Service social media, and this presentation, which will be uploaded on YouTube and will be a critical element of the recruitment process. So the next slide, we'll talk about, go ahead to the next slide. So the next slide talks about the actual design of the initiative. So the mentorship program will match Indigenous students at specified universities with Foreign Service officers interested in increasing Indigenous representation in the Foreign Service. Now the program will be volunteer-based. Mentors will be recruited through word of mouth, PAFSO Facebook, and the PAFSO email list. Participants will be recruited through reaching out to those specified universities that I mentioned before, and contacts at those universities, which will include existing PAFSO contacts, Indigenous student centers, and university career centers. We're going to need to develop application procedures, and this will likely include attendance at an information session that introduces students to Foreign Service careers and the program itself. Applicants will be informed of the opportunity through activities related to a recruitment and attraction plan that I'll talk about in a few moments. And a strategy for matching mentors and mentees will have to be determined. Attendance at networking events and regular check-ins between the mentor and the mentees will be required. And we'll have a plan to flesh out what communication methods and frequency will be desired. So moving on to the next slide. So we're going to need a way to reach out to potential mentees. So under the assumption that Indigenous students may not traditionally seek out careers in the Foreign Service, we're going to need direct action to stimulate interest among potential participants. And these could include things such as posters, social media campaigns, and information sessions or seminars through Teams and WebEx. We're going to need to consult with stakeholders on the plans that we have in place or that we propose. So those will include people at the universities, AMP Canada, current Indigenous FS officers, the Indigenous Peoples Networks at both GAC and IRCC, and departmental HR, because we don't want to duplicate necessarily what they may be doing. And we want to complement any efforts that are happening in this space with those organizations. And those stakeholders should be able to provide us with feedback and may be able to assist us with promotion or provide existing promotional materials that they may have, such as in the case of GAC or IRCC, as I know that they have had recruitment or attraction campaigns in the past. So another piece that's important to developing this initiative is to have training and development. So this program will include some training workshops on tips and tricks for applying to and getting hired as a Foreign Service officer. Mentors would engage in such activities as networking advice, mock interviews, career advice, and so on. To make sure that the mentors have a baseline in terms of knowledge or of Indigenous history, working with Indigenous peoples. There are a number of trainings that we'll be proposing and will be organized through this program, and that will include respectful practices for dealing with Indigenous peoples. An example of this is IRCC has training of this sort put on by the Indigenous Peoples Circle. We'll provide anti-Indigenous racism fact sheets, provide information on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, provide more information on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, encourage participants to enroll in the Indigenous Learning Series by the Canada School of Public Service. We'll provide Indigenous Ally Toolkits, excuse me, and share links to such things as the Micropedia of Microaggressions, and encourage a course such as is available with the University of Alberta Indigenous Learning Series. Moving on to the next slide. So how will we measure success? We definitely need a way to make sure that what we're doing is effective, that it's achieving the objectives that we want it to achieve. So we're going to develop a plan to measure satisfaction with the initiative from the point of view of both participants, mentees, and mentors throughout the life of the program. We're going to capture and track the number of applicants to the program, the number of participants in the initiative, and ultimately we should be able to find out the number of participants who join the public service and the Foreign Service in the future. So I talked a little bit before that we need to have effective stakeholder engagement. So a comprehensive stakeholder engagement plan will be necessary, which is going to really identify the specific stakeholders to be consulted and when they're to be consulted, and how, and in what aspects. So I think we would like, particularly from an Indigenous point of view, what is the thought with the participant attraction plan? does the design of the initiative make sense? And we would like their feedback on the training and development plans to make sure that the trainings that we're developing are in line with what would be expected from Indigenous organizations. Moving on to the next slide. So this is just to reaffirm that we do expect to see benefits from having this program. Increased awareness of foreign service as a career. The mentees will get career advice and other benefits that flow from having a mentee-mentor relationship. Mentors, of course, will also get the benefits that flow from a mentee-mentor relationship. So development of mentorship and leadership skills, and increased awareness of Indigenous issues, as well as reconciliation as a whole. Their ability to volunteer for their community and any other intrinsic words that may flow therefrom. Both the departments and PAFSA would benefit from a greater diversity in the foreign service population, as measured by the number or proportion of Indigenous foreign service officers. And in terms of risk, I've identified a number of possible issues with the initiative and how we're going to try to overcome those risks. So the first one is that continued commitment to this program may diminish over time. I mean, this is often something that happens with mentorship programs. And what we want to do to make sure that that doesn't happen is to balance continued refreshing of mentors and mentees each year, to have fresh perspectives and enthusiasm with program veterans to maintain like the memory of the initiative and experience. We'll continue to engage with stakeholders to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing. And we'll encourage broad-based participation so that the more people that we have on board with this, the more likely it is to maintain momentum throughout the life of this initiative. Now, the next risk is the possible general like hesitance on the part of Indigenous students to ultimately apply for a public service rotational position outside of Canada. I mean, there's no secret that foreign service life is it can be challenging. So how we would propose to respond to that is to, like I said, engage with foreign service, Indigenous foreign service officers, past and present, perhaps provide examples, role models of Indigenous foreign service officers, both high profile ones that have served in the foreign service in the past, and lower profile rank and file members. And as diverse a group of Indigenous foreign service officers as possible. Continued promotion of the career and this initiative will be essential, and continuing to engage with Indigenous organizations within government and within the target universities will be necessary as well. So another risk is currently, it may be that there is limited awareness of foreign service careers among Indigenous students, and that may result in limited interest in the program. So we're going to need to ensure that our attraction and recruitment and communication plans are as strong as possible, and that they promote foreign service careers. We would do information sessions specifically targeting Indigenous students, and have a targeted social media presence as well. We want to ensure that the benefits of participating are clearly communicated to potential participants, and also, of course, to give a realistic view of what it's like. Another risk is that there could be, I'm sorry, this is a repetition of the previous slide. Moving to the next slide. The final risk is we may have inadequately prepared mentors, mentees, and program coordinators for this program, and that may lead to program failure. And in order to respond to that, we're going to make sure that we have clear mentor-mentee role descriptions, training resources, regular check-ins, We're going to ensure that mentors and mentees meet regularly, and we'll provide relevant opportunities to gather together as a wider group, either virtually and in person, if that is possible, to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're all working towards the same goal. And we're going to ensure that the program provides enough information about the career, and we're going to make sure that there's PAFSO support for this program and the people who are running the program, so that the program ultimately succeeds. So what are the timelines? So here we are in the fall of 2022. So we've drafted the initiative. We've put together an initiative brief that explains essentially everything that I've told you about so far. We've announced this initiative at the AGM, and we are doing this current presentation right now. The next steps is to finalize and organize a working group, so to get some members to join on, so that we can have a community approach to moving forward with this initiative. Each of the different deliverables that I mentioned before, although we do have development of those to some degree. A few of them would benefit from an expansion and a review by experienced Foreign Service officers, so that we can make sure that those plans are as strong as possible. So that has to be done in the fall of this year. And then we would also, once we have those at a ready enough state, we would want to begin the engagement with Indigenous and educational partners, both within and outside of government. And then after we've got the input of those stakeholders, then we would finalize the deliverables in the winter. Moving on to the next slide. And then we would be able to begin. So the first step would be to finalize our mentor list, kick off the training for the mentors. Then we would execute the attraction and recruitment activities starting in the summer. And once we've got a cohort of mentees, we would set up a kickoff event for both the mentors and the mentees. And over the year, then the mentor and the mentee would essentially execute on that mentorship plan. At the end of the year, and actually on an ongoing basis, we would want to evaluate the effectiveness of the program, and at the end, do our lessons learned, so that we can adjust the program as we move into the second year. Which would ultimately, or basically, duplicate what we've done in the first year. And so it's hoped that by the end of the second year, we would be in a position to understand and have a strong program that would be able to continue for as long as necessary, for a long time. So moving on to the next slide. So just to clarify who the participants for this program would be. So the program participants will be self-identified Indigenous undergraduate and graduate students in any discipline, but especially relevant programs to Foreign Service careers at specific universities. So we're thinking initially Carleton, because of its links with PAFSO already, Queen's University. And the reason for that is essentially that I know I'm a current student at Queen's. I'm in the Professional Master of Public Administration program, and I know that the organization does have an Indigenous focus. And I think it may be because of those links and because of the organization, I think it's a good possibility. We would consider also the University of Ottawa, the University of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, McGill in the future. There are also a couple of First Nations educational institutions that I've identified that who are majority First Nations students, which may be possible places to look at for recruitment as well. And that's First Nations University of Canada in Saskatchewan and the First Nations Technical Institute, which is in just close to Napanee. And these other universities would come in later. I think we would want to start small with just 2 or 3 universities in the first year. So mentors. The mentors will be foreign service officers from any profile. And they just need to be interested in the objectives of the initiative as a whole. And so these mentors will receive training on Indigenous issues. And finally, Indigenous FS. The number of Indigenous FS, as I've mentioned before, may be small, but any Indigenous FS who would be interested in participating in the program would be extremely welcome, because they'd be particularly suited to serve on the program working group and to share their perspective, experience, and insight as Indigenous Foreign Service officers. And they would also be ideal mentors as well. So that's who we're looking at for the participants. So that is the end of my presentation. Now, I know you may have feedback or questions, but I'd love to get any reactions that people on the call may have to what I've spoken about today.
Oh, thanks, William. I mean, this is a really thorough presentation. I think you've done tons of work, and I mean, it's even gone further since the last time that we talked about it. So I really appreciate it. But I think, yeah, it sounds like you've got a really good plan. Can I just, a practical question, how many folks are you looking for to start the initial working group? Like, how many do you think we would need? I guess we want at least a couple from each stream if we can, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if we can, that would be great. Maybe I'm not as ambitious as that. I mean, it really depends on interest. The more the better, though, I think, to be honest. So if we got up to 2 per each stream, I think that would be amazing. But we don't necessarily need that many. Really, the working group work, I don't think, is going to be that arduous. So the number of people that could join, I mean, really, the sky's the limit. But I would see that we would welcome anyone who would want to drive this project forward.
Yeah, so target, say 8 to 10 people roughly. I'm just trying to get a sense of how intensive a recruitment campaign.
Well, this part, the working group. I mean, we're gonna promote it. We're gonna try and recruit people through word of mouth. Yeah, 8 to 10. That would be good. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. And I understand. I remember you had spoken to some members of some Indigenous FS and some members of the Indigenous networks. And what was their reaction? I mean, they seem to think this is a good initiative.
Okay, so I haven't actually done that at this stage. I wanted to make sure that we had a solid foundation and a bit more detail in what we are going to do. This may be sufficient now. But hopefully, if we have just a bit more information, I could answer a few potential questions on some of the things that we're going to be doing. I would be a bit more comfortable. But yeah, that's definitely something that we need to start doing once we have all of the initiative pieces completed. So I haven't actually gone that far at this stage.
Okay, no, I know. I mean, I've mentioned it a few times at different events, you know, at the Diversity and Inclusion Council and different times. And the general reaction has been like, oh, wow, that sounds good. You know, we're interested. So I think my impression was that, you know, people think it's important. People seem to welcome the idea that we're doing something, you know, that's related to our particular purpose, right, as PAFSO. We're sticking in our lane, and seem to appreciate the idea that, you know, we're going to be providing training for the mentors as well, to make sure everybody has a baseline, you know, in reconciliation issues, and, you know, and to avoid maybe, you know, some of the well-meaning but dangerous mistakes that people might make in you know, trying to engage. So I think that that'll be key, is looking at what we could do with that. And we're going to be hiring, Bird is just getting the job description translated, but we're in the next couple of days, we're going to launch the competition for we're calling it ASRO, Advocacy and Strategic Relations Officer. Or sorry, Advocacy and Stakeholder Relations Officer, you know, to work with us in the PAFSO office on the whole issue of, you know, getting our advocacy, public advocacy, and advocacy with parliamentarians and so on, you know, more organized and out there. And that person could also certainly help with the engagement program for this.
Well, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, I would see that as part of their job description, you know. And I mean, their main deliverable is going to be the overall plan for the first year, but, you know, they're going to want to get involved, I'm sure, with other things. So it's a good time for us. We have, you know, we're starting to get some resources in place that will support all of this. And I mean, ultimately, we may want to, you know, expand this and have like a wider mentorship program for, you know, various underrepresented groups, right? But I think that starting small with this pilot program and focused on reconciliation, you know, we can see how it goes, and it may give us a good test case for expanding out.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that's absolutely right, Pam. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm not sure if anybody else had anything to say.
Does anybody want to raise their hand? Or, I mean, what we could do is that we could say thank you. And if anyone wants to speak now on the recording, please speak now. If you have anything you'd like to have on the recording for others to hear the answers later. I'm not seeing any hands, so maybe I'll just say thank you very much, William. I hope people will be interested in this, and we can talk after about how I can publicize it in my message, and how we can get the word out to people who couldn't make it to the presentation at 7 in the morning. Yeah, say thanks. And Marty, could you turn off the recording?